Lieutenant Kale Rorik pulled his fighter into a tight roll, defying the gravitational compensators and feeling the pressure squeeze against his chest. The simulator's neural feedback system sent jolts of realistic G-force sensations through his body as warning lights flashed across his heads-up display. According to every flight manual in the Terran Coalition fleet, the maneuver he was attempting should have torn his ship apart. But Kale wasn't following any manual. Lieutenant Rorik returned to formation immediately. Captain Eva Rostova's voice crackled through his comm system, tight with frustration. "You're breaking squadron cohesion again." Kale ignored the command, his focus narrowing to a pinpoint as he entered what he privately called the flow state. That perfect moment when instinct replaced thought, when the ship became an extension of his body, and when the chaos of space combat transformed into a pattern only he could see. The 5 simulated synthetic fighters pursuing him had perfect formation, perfect predictive algorithms. They anticipated where standard evasive maneuvers would take him. But Kale wasn't flying standard anything. He cut thrust, spun his fighter in a manner that would have been suicide in most circumstances, then re-engaged his engines in a burst that sent him hurtling backward through the formation of enemy ships. His targeting system locked, and with 3 precise shots, he eliminated 3 synthetic fighters before they could recalculate their approach. "That's enough." Captain Rostova's voice had moved from frustration to outright anger. Simulation terminated. The virtual battlefield dissolved around him, replaced by the sterile white walls of the simulator chamber. Kale pulled off his neural interface helmet and ran a hand through his dark, sweat-dampened hair. He already knew what was coming. Captain Eva Rostova stood at the simulator control station, her tall frame rigid with barely contained fury. Her close-cropped silver hair and the deep lines around her eyes spoke of decades of military service, all of it by the book. "Lieutenant, do you have any explanation for why you once again abandoned formation and failed to follow direct orders?" she asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical. Kale stepped out of the simulator pod, meeting her gaze directly. "I eliminated all targets with 0 casualties on our side. The mission was a success." "That's not how we measure success in this fleet," Rostova countered. "Predictability, coordination, and following orders are what keep pilots alive. Your recklessness would get real pilots killed in a real battle." "With all due respect, Captain," Kale said, gesturing toward the score display, "the predictable approach has resulted in a 70% casualty rate in our engagements with the synthetics. Their prediction algorithms tear our formations apart because they know exactly what we're going to do before we do it." The tension in the simulator room was palpable as other pilots gathered, watching the confrontation. Among them was Flight Commander Reese Takeda, a veteran pilot with salt and pepper hair who had survived more actual engagements with the synthetics than anyone else in the squadron. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes tracked Kale with undisguised interest. "Lieutenant Rorik," Rostova said, lowering her voice, "you have the best reflexes and raw piloting talent I've seen in 20 years. But talent without discipline is worse than useless. It's dangerous. If you can't follow protocol, I'll have you grounded permanently. Is that understood?" Kale nodded stiffly. "Understood, Captain." As the pilots dispersed, Reese lingered behind, approaching Kale with a measured stride. "That was some flying," he said quietly. "Never seen anyone handle a Wasp-class fighter like that." "Fat lot of good it does if I'm grounded," Kale muttered. "Rostova's harsh, but she has reason to be," Reese said. "She's lost too many pilots following textbook maneuvers that the synthetics predict with perfect accuracy. Still, she's right about one thing. A lone wolf approach won't win this war." Kale was about to respond when the carrier's alert system blared. A tense voice came over the ship-wide comm. "All pilots report to Briefing Room Alpha immediately." "This is not a drill. Repeat, all pilots to Briefing Room Alpha." The room was already packed when Kale arrived. Admiral Volkov, the fleet commander, stood at the front, his imposing frame and scarred face commanding immediate silence when he raised his hand. "We've received intelligence that the synthetics are developing a new weapons platform that could shift the balance of this war decisively in their favor," Volkov stated without preamble. We've located their research facility in the Cygnus Nebula. A reconnaissance mission is required to gather details before we can plan a strike. Holographic displays lit up, showing the target location deep within. Synthetic-controlled space, surrounded by automated defense platforms and patrol routes. This is a volunteer mission, Admiral Volkov continued, his voice grave. Standard approach vectors have been calculated, but I won't pretend the risk isn't extreme. We need a four-ship formation to gather sufficient data and provide mutual protection. Kale felt a chill run through him as he studied the tactical display. The approach corridors were heavily monitored. Any ships following standard TCF flight paths would be detected within minutes. It was practically a suicide mission. Before he could stop himself, Kale spoke up. "Sir, with respect, the standard approach won't work. They'll be waiting for us." A tense silence fell over the room. Admiral Volkov's cold eyes fixed on Kale. "Do you have an alternative suggestion, Lieutenant Rewrote?" "I do, sir," Kale said, stepping forward. "A high-risk insertion using gravitational slingshots around these three dwarf stars. It would involve complex, non-standard flight paths that the synthetic prediction models won't anticipate." Captain Rostova immediately objected. That approach would require extraordinary piloting skills and would make formation flying nearly impossible. "It's reckless. It's also our only chance of getting in undetected," Kale countered. "The synthetics expect logic and efficiency. They predict our movements because we fly in ways that make mathematical sense. What if we didn't?" Admiral Volkov studied the alternate route Kale had indicated. "The risk is significant either way, Captain Rostova. Assemble your team. You leave in 6 hours." As the briefing dispersed, Rostova cornered Kale. "I should ground you for that display, but we need every pilot. You'll fly in this mission, but you will follow my orders precisely. Is that understood?" "Yes, Captain," Kale replied, while silently knowing that once they entered synthetic space, following the rulebook would be a death sentence. 6 hours later, Kale sat in the cockpit of his Wasp-class fighter, running final checks as the carrier's launch bay prepared to release the reconnaissance team. Captain Rostova would lead, with Kale, Reese, and a younger pilot named Sarah forming the small squadron. "All ships, final comm check." Rostova's voice came through crystal clear. "Rewrote, systems green," Kale responded. "Takeda, ready for launch." "Sarah, all systems nominal." The massive launch doors began to slide open, revealing the vast darkness of space, punctuated by the distant glow of the Cygnus Nebula. Kale felt the familiar tightness in his chest. Not fear, but anticipation. Out there, in the void, was where he truly belonged. "Launch in 3, 2, 1. Initiate," Rostova commanded. For fighters shot out of the bay in perfect formation, accelerating toward the edge of friendly space. For the first 2 hours, they maintained standard approach vectors, conserving fuel and remaining vigilant for any signs of synthetic patrols. As they approached the border of contested space, Rostova's voice crackled over the comm. "Prepare for Phase 2 approach. Switch to a mission-controlled mode and maintain formation distance at 200 meters." Kale checked his tactical display. They were approaching the first decision point. Continue on the predictable path or diverge to a suggested route. His hand hovered over the thruster controls. "Captain," he said, "request permission to take point for the nebula approach. The gravitational fields will be tricky." There was a pause before Rostova responded. "Negative, Lieutenant. We maintain formation as planned." Kale's jaw tightened. They were flying into a trap, and Rostova knew it. But she was committed to protocol, even if it got them all killed. They crossed into synthetic-controlled space without incident, which only heightened Kale's anxiety. The silence was unnatural. The synthetics were too efficient to leave such an obvious approach unmonitored. As they entered the outer boundaries of the nebula, Kale's sensors detected a faint energy signature. It was barely perceptible, a whisper in the void, but his instincts screamed danger. "Captain, I'm picking up unusual readings at bearing 047, he reported. "Nothing on my sensors," Rostova replied. "Maintain course." Kale felt it before he saw it. a sudden shift in the electromagnetic field surrounding them. "Evasive action!" he shouted, breaking formation and diving sharply just as space itself seemed to erupt around them. Synthetic fighters materialized from concealed positions, their energy signatures suddenly blazing to life. It wasn't a patrol, it was an ambush. At least 20 synthetic craft converged on their position, firing with deadly precision. "Scatter and regroup at checkpoint Delta," Rostova ordered as her ship took a glancing hit that sent it spinning. Kel didn't think. He simply flew. Time slowed as he entered his flow state, the universe reducing to trajectories, energy signatures, and instinct. He curved his fighter in unpredictable patterns, using the nebula's gas clouds and magnetic fields to mask his movements. The synthetic targeting systems, designed to predict logical evasion patterns, struggled to lock onto his chaotic flight path. Through his comms, he heard the panicked voice of Sarah. "I can't shake them. They're predicting my every move." Kale saw Sarah's fighter following textbook evasive maneuvers, which the synthetics countered with ruthless efficiency. Before he could intervene, Sarah's ship erupted in a silent explosion. Rage and determination filled Kale as he abruptly reversed thrust, spinning his fighter in a maneuver that defied the ship's design parameters. The compensators whined in protest as he accelerated directly toward the 3 synthetic fighters pursuing Reese's damaged vessel. "What the hell are you doing, Rorik?" Reese shouted over the comm. "Trust me," Kale responded, his voice eerily calm. "Brake left on my mark. Now." Reese's fighter veered sharply left as Kale opened fire, his unconventional approach angle catching the synthetic fighters off guard. 2 exploded immediately, while the third adjusted its course to intercept Kale. In the distance, he could see Rostova's fighter taking heavy fire, its shields flickering as they approached failure. The formation was shattered, the mission in tatters. Kale made a split-second decision. "Captain Reese, follow my lead exactly. Forget the protocols. Fly like you've never flown before." Without waiting for acknowledgement, Kale accelerated toward a dense cluster of nebula gases, his fighter weaving in patterns that seemed random but were guided by his deep intuition of space dynamics. To his surprise, both Rostova and Reese followed, mimicking his erratic movements as best they could. The pursuing synthetics, programmed to anticipate logical flight patterns, struggled to adjust. Their shots went wide, and several collided with nebula debris they had calculated would be avoided by any rational pilot. "What are you doing?" Rostova demanded, her voice strained as her damaged fighter struggled to keep pace. "The synthetics predict our moves because we fly logically," Kale explained, executing another impossible turn. "They can't predict chaos. They can't predict human intuition at its most primal." Using the nebula's magnetic fields and gravitational eddies, Kale led them through an impossible maze, eventually finding temporary shelter in the lee of a massive asteroid. The 3 surviving fighters powered down to minimal systems, becoming nearly invisible against the background radiation. Rostova's face appeared on Kale's comm screen, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. "That was unconventional," she admitted grudgingly. "It kept us alive," Kale replied. "Captain, we still have a mission. The synthetic research facility can't be far from here. That's why the response was so overwhelming. They're protecting something important." "Half our squadron is gone," Rostova said grimly. "We should retreat while we can." Reese's voice joined the conversation. "With respect, Captain, we may not get another chance. Whatever they're developing in there, it's worth dying to protect, which means it's worth a risk to discover." Kale watched as conflict played across Rostova's features. 20 years of military discipline warring with the undeniable reality that conventional tactics had failed them. "We proceed," she finally said, "but not by the book. Rorik, you take point. Fly however you need to. Reese and I will follow as best we can." It was the closest thing to vindication Kale had ever received from his captain. He nodded solemnly. "We'll need to push deeper into the nebula and approach from the facility's far side. It's counterintuitive, which means it's the last thing they'll expect." For the next hour, they navigated the treacherous nebula, systems running at minimal power, communicating in brief bursts to avoid detection. Kale led them through a series of gravitational anomalies that would have been deemed too dangerous in any flight manual, but which provided perfect cover for their approach. When they finally caught sight of the synthetic facility, the reason for the heavy defense became clear. It wasn't just a research station, it was an entire production complex, with dozens of new ships unlike anything they'd encountered before. "Those aren't standard synthetic fighters," Reese whispered over the comm. "They're bigger, more heavily armed." "We need to get closer," Rostova decided. "Passive scans only. If we can identify their capabilities, it could change the course of the war." They drifted closer, using the nebula's electromagnetic interference to mask their approach. Kale's sensors picked up unusual energy, readings emanating from the new synthetic craft. "Captain, I think these ships are equipped with some kind of gravity manipulation technology," he reported. "The energy signature is consistent with theoretical models for controlled microsingularities. If the synthetics have developed weaponized gravity control." Rostova didn't need to finish the thought. Such technology would render traditional TCF defenses useless. Suddenly, alarms flared across Kale's cockpit. "We've been spotted. Evasive action." The three fighters broke away as synthetic defense platforms began firing in their direction. What had been a reconnaissance mission was now a desperate fight for survival. "We have what we came for," Rostova shouted over the comm. "Full retreat." But retreat wasn't simple. Dozens of synthetic fighters launched from the facility, forming a blockade between them and the safety of coalition space. "We'll never make it through their lines with conventional maneuvers," Kale said grimly. "Then we don't use conventional maneuvers," Rostova replied, surprising him. "You've shown us another way to fly, Lieutenant. Now show us how to get home." With renewed determination, Kale led them into the most chaotic, unpredictable flight pattern he could devise. They used the nebulous gases for cover, executed maneuvers that stressed their ships to the breaking point, and flew in ways that defied all logical prediction algorithms. The synthetic pursuit faltered as their targeting systems failed to compensate for the seemingly random movements of the human pilots. Kale felt a grim satisfaction as he watched synthetic fighters collide with each other, their perfect formation becoming a liability in the face of chaos. But the escape wasn't without cost. As they neared the edge of synthetic space, Rostova's already damaged fighter took a direct hit to its propulsion system. "My engines are failing," she reported, her voice remarkably calm. "You two continue. Get the intelligence back to the fleet." "Not happening, Captain," Kale responded immediately. "Reese, cover us. I'm going to attempt a tow connection." "That's an order, Lieutenant," Rostova barked. "The mission comes first." Kale ignored her, maneuvering his fighter alongside her crippled vessel. "With respect, Captain, I've never been good at following orders." Using emergency tether cables designed for rescuing ejected pilots, not entire ships, Kale secured a tenuous connection to Rostova's fighter. The strain on his engines was immediate and severe, but he compensated by using the nebula's gravitational currents to assist. "Rewrote, you're insane," Reese commented, but there was unmistakable admiration in his voice as he provided covering fire. The journey back to coalition space was grueling. Kale's fighter protested every moment, systems failing one by one as he pushed the ship beyond its design limits. But somehow, drawing on reserves of skill and intuition he barely understood himself, he maintained the tow and the erratic flight pattern that kept the synthetic pursuers at bay. When they finally crossed back into friendly space, coalition patrol ships rushed to their aid, driving off the remaining synthetic pursuers. As medical teams rushed to extract the injured Rostova from her damaged fighter, she caught Kale's arm. "That wasn't in any flight manual I've ever read," she said weakly. Kale nodded. "Some things can't be taught from a manual, Captain." "Perhaps," she conceded. "It's time we wrote a new one." The intelligence they gathered sent shockwaves through TCF High Command. The synthetic gravity weapons represented a potential turning point in the war, and preparations for countermeasures began immediately. But for Kale, the aftermath of the mission brought unexpected consequences. rather than the commendation he might have expected for saving his captain and bringing back critical intelligence. Kale found himself facing a disciplinary hearing. Admiral Volkov himself presided, his expression granite-like as he reviewed the mission logs. Lieutenant Rewrote, while the outcome of your mission was successful, your methods represent a fundamental breach of coalition flight protocols, Volkov stated. Captain Rostova's report indicates that you repeatedly disobeyed direct orders and endangered the mission with unauthorized maneuvers. Kale stood at attention, prepared to accept whatever punishment was coming. To his surprise, Captain Rostova, still bandaged from her injuries, spoke in his defense. Admiral, with respect, I've submitted a supplementary report, she said. Lieutenant Rewrote's unconventional methods are what saved the mission and my life. The synthetics have perfected their ability to predict and counter our standard tactical approaches. What we witnessed in the Cygnus Nebula suggests we need a fundamental reevaluation of our combat doctrine. Volkov's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting we abandon generations of proven space combat tactics, Captain? I'm suggesting they're no longer effective against this enemy, Rostova replied steadily. The synthetics learn and adapt. We must do the same. The hearing was adjourned without a decision, but Kale knew the matter was far from resolved. In the days that followed, he found himself in an unusual position, neither punished nor commended, but the subject of intense scrutiny from both his peers and superiors. It was during this limbo period that he was approached by a civilian scientist attached to the carrier's research division. Dr. Eris Thorne was tall and thin, with penetrating eyes that seemed to see more than most. His expertise spanned multiple fields, from theoretical physics to xenolinguistics, making him one of the fleet's most valuable analytical assets. Lieutenant Rewrote, Dr. Thorne said, finding him in the carrier's observation deck, staring out at the stars. I've been studying the flight data from your recent mission. Fascinating patterns you created there. Kale shrugged. I just flew by instinct, Doctor. Nothing scientific about it. On the contrary, Thorne said, his eyes lighting up with intellectual excitement. Your flight patterns exhibit properties consistent with chaotic systems theory. Predictable unpredictability, if you'll forgive the paradox. May I ask, when you fly like that, what do you experience? Kale considered the question carefully. It's like time slows down. I stop thinking and just feel the ship, the space around me. Pilots call it the zone, but I think of it as a flow state. Everything connects. Dr. Thorne nodded eagerly. Fascinating. And these patterns you create, they seem to confound the synthetic targeting systems. They rely on prediction algorithms, Kale explained. They can't predict what doesn't follow logical patterns. Or perhaps, Thorne suggested, they cannot predict what follows a deeper pattern, one based on human intuition rather than computational logic. Lieutenant, would you be willing to participate in some experiments? I have a theory I'd like to test. Before Kale could respond, Captain Rostova approached them, her movement still stiff from her injuries. Dr. Thorne, I see you found our unconventional pilot. I hope you're not encouraging further insubordination. Thorne smiled. On the contrary, Captain, I believe Lieutenant Rewrote may have stumbled upon something that could revolutionize our approach to fighting the synthetics. But I'll need your help to explore it properly. Rostova's expression was guarded. Explain. The synthetics predict our movements because we fly according to logical, teachable patterns, Thorne elaborated. But what if we could train pilots to fly like Lieutenant Rewrote, to operate on intuition and create flight patterns that follow chaotic rather than logical principles? Most pilots spend years learning to suppress instinct in favor of discipline, Rostova pointed out. Exactly, Thorne said. But what if that's exactly what makes us vulnerable to the synthetics? They've mastered our discipline. Perhaps it's time we reclaimed our chaos. A week later, in a secluded section of the carrier's simulator deck, Kale found himself standing before a small group of pilots hand-selected by Captain Rostova. Reese was among them, along with 4 others who had demonstrated both exceptional skill and open-minded attitudes toward unconventional tactics. This is not official training, Rostova warned them. What happens in this room stays in this room until we have results to present to Admiral Volkov. Is that understood? The pilots nodded, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Lieutenant Rorick will be leading these sessions, Rostova continued. Dr. Thorne will monitor and analyze the results. Your objective is simple but challenging. Learn to fly by instinct rather than protocol. Cale stepped forward, feeling strangely nervous. He was a pilot, not an instructor, and what he did in the cockpit was more felt than thought. I can't teach you a specific technique, he admitted. What I do, it's about letting go of the rule book and trusting something deeper. Dr. Thorne calls it chaos flying, but it's really about finding a flow state where you and your ship become one entity. That sounds more like philosophy than combat tactics, one of the younger pilots commented skeptically. Reese spoke up. I've seen it work. Watched Rorick here fly through a synthetic ambush like water through rocks. They couldn't touch him. Dr. Thorne activated the simulator's main display. We've developed a program that mimics synthetic targeting algorithms. Standard evasive maneuvers result in a hit rate of 83%. Lieutenant Rorick's chaos flying reduces that to 17%. The numbers speak for themselves. Over the following days, Cale struggled to articulate what came naturally to him. The pilots were skilled, disciplined professionals, but breaking them out of ingrained patterns proved challenging. Simulator sessions often ended in frustration as they fell back into predictable maneuvers under pressure. You're still thinking too much, Cale told them after a particularly disappointing session. You need to feel the space around you, not calculate it. That's not how we were trained, one pilot protested. We spent years learning precision formations and coordinated maneuvers. And the synthetics have spent years learning to counter them, Cale replied. We need something they can't predict. Breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During a simulation, Reese's neural interface malfunctioned, disrupting his ability to access the ship's tactical systems. Forced to fly almost blind, relying on basic visuals and instinct, his performance suddenly improved dramatically. That's it, Dr. Thorne exclaimed, studying the data. The interface was feeding you too much information, encouraging analytical thinking. Without it, you were forced to rely on intuition. Inspired by this discovery, they modified the training approach. Instead of trying to teach chaos directly, they began by limiting the information available to the pilots, forcing them to develop and trust their instincts. Gradually, patterns emerged that were neither random nor predictable in conventional terms. They followed what Thorne began calling chaos field theory. It's as if the human mind, when freed from too much analytical input, creates its own patterns that exist just at the edge of chaos and order, Thorne explained excitedly. Mathematically beautiful, but impossible to predict without understanding the unique consciousness creating them. The training continued in secret for 3 weeks. Progress was uneven but promising. Reese proved especially adept, his years of experience giving him a foundation upon which to build new instincts. Others struggled more, particularly those who had spent the longest time flying by the book. Their clandestine operation came to an abrupt end when Admiral Volkov personally appeared at the simulator deck during a session. The pilots snapped to attention as the Admiral surveyed the modified simulation programs and unusual flight pattern displays. Captain Rostova, he said, his voice dangerously calm, I don't recall authorizing an experimental flight program. Rostova stepped forward. No, sir. This initiative was my responsibility. And mine, Dr. Thorne added quickly. The scientific potential was too significant to ignore. Volkov's cold gaze swept over them. You've diverted resources, personnel, and time to an unauthorized project in the middle of a war. Give me one reason why I shouldn't have you all court-martialed immediately. Dr. Thorne activated the main display, showing comparative performance data. Because it's working, Admiral. These pilots are achieving evasion rates that render synthetic targeting systems nearly useless. If implemented fleet-wide, it could change the course of a war. Volkov studied the data, his expression unreadable. Theoretical simulations are one thing, Doctor. Combat is another. Then let us prove it, Cale said, stepping forward. A real-world test against synthetic forces. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. You're asking me to risk pilots and ships on an untested combat theory, Lieutenant? We're already losing pilots daily to the synthetic prediction systems, Kale countered. How much worse could this be? Before Volkov could respond, the carrier's alert system blared. A communications officer rushed in, saluting hastily. Admiral, urgent transmission from Coalition Outpost Artemis. They're under heavy synthetic attack, like nothing we've seen before. They're requesting immediate reinforcement. Outpost Artemis was a critical strategic position, controlling access to a key hyperspace junction. Its loss would open Coalition supply lines to synthetic attack across multiple sectors. Volkov's decision was immediate. Prepare all fighter squadrons for launch. Captain Rostova, your regular squadron will join the defense force. As the room emptied, Volkov held Kale back with a raised hand. Lieutenant Rewrote, he said quietly, I'm giving you and these 5 pilots one chance to prove your theory. You'll join the defense as Chaos Squadron, under Captain Rostova's direct command. If your methods work, I'll reconsider my position on this program. If they don't, he left the consequence unspoken. Within the hour, Kale found himself once again in his fighter's cockpit, launching into the void. But this time was different. This time, he led 5 other pilots who had embraced his chaotic flying style, about to test it against the deadliest force humanity had ever encountered. The jump to Outpost Artemis took less than 20 minutes. When they emerged from hyperspace, the scene that greeted them was one of devastation. The outpost's outer defenses were already in ruins, and a massive synthetic fleet surrounded the main station. At the center of the enemy formation was a ship unlike any Kale had seen before, larger, more complex, emanating unusual energy signatures. That's a command node, Doctor. Thorne's voice came through their secure channel. He was monitoring from the carrier. All synthetic ships in the area will be receiving tactical coordination from it. Destroy it, and the entire attack force will lose efficiency. Conventional squadrons engage the outer defensive screen. Admiral Volkov ordered from the fleet command ship. Chaos Squadron, target the command node. Let's see if your unpredictability is as effective as you claim. Captain Rostova's voice came through on their squadron channel. Chaos Squadron, formation is meaningless for this approach. Fly as you've trained. Support each other, but follow your instincts. Lieutenant Rewrote will take point. Kale took a deep breath, feeling the familiar sensation of the flow state beginning to wash over him. Chaos Squadron, acknowledge. One by one, the pilots responded. Reese's voice was the last and the most confident. Ready to rewrite the rules of space combat, Lieutenant. Kale accelerated toward the massive synthetic fleet, his fighter quickly breaking from any recognizable approach pattern. Behind him, the other 5 ships followed, each taking their own chaotic path while maintaining loose coordination. The effect on the synthetic defenses was immediate and dramatic. Accustomed to engaging human fighters that followed predictable patterns, their targeting systems struggled to lock onto the erratically moving ships. The few shots that came close were instinctively avoided, as if the human pilots could feel rather than see the danger. It's working, Reese called out, his voice elated as he spiraled through a gap in the synthetic formation that should have been impossible to navigate. Stay focused, Kale cautioned, pushing deeper toward the command node. They'll adapt eventually. And adapt they did. The command node began emitting new signals, and the synthetic fighters adjusted their approach, attempting to create an impenetrable wall of fire that would catch the humans regardless of their flight path. They're trying to saturate the area with weapons fire, Dr. Thorne observed, creating a probability field that doesn't rely on targeting individual ships. Kale processed this information instantly. Chaos Squadron, they're changing tactics. We need to change too. Don't just fly randomly. Feel the pattern of their fire and find the gaps before they appear. It was a nearly impossible instruction, yet somehow the trained pilots understood. They pushed deeper into the flow state, not just evading fire, but anticipating where it wouldn't be. The effect was mesmerizing to watch. Human fighters sliding through impossibly small gaps in the synthetic defense, appearing almost precognitive in their movements. They penetrated deeper than any human squadron had ever managed against a coordinated synthetic force. As they approached the command node, however, the resistance intensified. One of the Chaos Squadron pilots took a direct hit, their ship disintegrating in a flash of light. "We've lost Sarah," Reese reported grimly. "Keep moving," Rostova ordered. "We won't let her sacrifice be in vain." The command node recognized the threat now, directing more of its subordinate ships to intercept the approaching humans. Kale found himself facing increasingly sophisticated counterattacks as the synthetic intelligence attempted to identify patterns in his seemingly patternless flight. "They're learning," he realized. "Dr. Thorne, we need something new. They're starting to predict even our chaos." "That's theoretically impossible unless—" Thorne's voice trailed off, then returned with renewed excitement. "Unless they're developing a counter-algorithm in real time. This confirms my hypothesis about the nature of the chaos field. Lieutenant, tell your pilots to introduce conscious irregularities, moments of deliberate pattern followed by its violent disruption. Create false predictability, then break it." Kale relayed the instructions as he demonstrated the technique, briefly flying in a recognizable evasive pattern before shattering it with an impossible maneuver just as the synthetic targeting systems locked on. The effect was immediate. The synthetic ships wasted resources predicting a pattern that instantly dissolved. With this new approach, they closed the final distance to the command node. Its defenses were formidable, its hull impervious to standard fighter weapons. "We need to hit the central processing core," Dr. Thorne advised. "The energy readings suggest it's located in the upper hemisphere of the structure." "I see it," Kale confirmed, identifying a cluster of heat signatures and power fluctuations. "But we'll need to get past those point defense systems first." The final approach was the most challenging yet. The command node's defenses were operating on multiple simultaneous targeting algorithms, creating a defense that seemed truly impenetrable. One more of their squadron was lost, their ship clipped by defense, laser, and sent spinning into the path of a synthetic fighter. "We can't break through," Rostova admitted, her voice strained as she executed a series of impossible maneuvers to avoid incoming fire. "There are too many overlapping defense systems." Kale studied the command node, feeling rather than seeing the patterns of its defense. "We need to synchronize," he realized. "Not in formation, but in chaos." "Dr. Thorne, can you calculate a resonance pattern that would align our chaotic trajectories at a single point in space-time?" "Theoretically," Thorne's voice was hesitant, "but the timing would need to be perfect, and the calculation would require—" "Don't calculate it," Kale interrupted. "Feel it. Chaos Squadron, focus on the target point. Synchronize your chaos with mine. When you feel the moment, not see it, feel it. Unleash everything you've got." It was an impossible instruction by any conventional standard. How could chaos be synchronized? How could randomness align? But the pilots who had spent weeks training with Kale understood on a level deeper than conscious thought. "I feel it," Reese was the first to confirm. One by one, the remaining pilots acknowledged their ships beginning to move in patterns that seemed random to outside observation, but contained a strange, underlying harmony. The synthetic defenses reacted with increasing aggression, unable to predict the convergence point of these chaotic vectors. The command node directed more energy to its shields, creating a swirling barrier of gravitational distortion that would tear apart any ship that approached on a predictable course. But these ships followed no predictable course. Their patterns existed in a space between order and randomness that the synthetic mind, for all its computational power, could not grasp. "Now!" Kale shouted, feeling rather than seeing the perfect moment of alignment. For fighters converged from impossible angles, their weapons firing in perfect unison. The combined energy of their attack, focused through the gravitational lens of the command node's own defensive field, punched through the shield and struck the processing core with devastating effect. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the command node began to pulse with unstable energy. Secondary explosions rippled across its surface as its coordination systems failed catastrophically. "Get clear," Rostova ordered, and the surviving pilots scattered in their signature unpredictable patterns just as the command node detonated in a spectacular implosion. The effect on the synthetic fleet was immediate and dramatic. Without the coordinating intelligence of the command node, the individual ships reverted to basic programming. Some continued fighting, but with greatly reduced efficiency. Others seemed to lose purpose entirely, drifting aimlessly or withdrawing from the battle altogether. Coalition forces pressed the advantage. Admiral Volkov's voice boomed across all channels. "The enemy is disorganized. Finish this." The battle that had been on the verge of defeat turned swiftly in the coalition's favor. Within hours, the synthetic attack force had been routed and Outpost Artemis secured. The cost had been high, dozens of coalition ships and hundreds of lives lost, but the strategic position had been held. As Kale guided his damaged fighter back to the carrier's landing bay, exhaustion washed over him. The flow state faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the beginning of grief for the pilots they had lost. But there was something else too, a sense of validation, of vindication. In the aftermath of the battle, Kale expected to face another hearing. Instead, he found himself summoned to Admiral Volkov's private quarters aboard the flagship. Captain Rostova and Dr. Thorne were already present when he arrived. Lieutenant Rewrote, Volkov greeted him, his tone neutral but not hostile. "I've reviewed the combat footage from Outpost Artemis. Your Chaos Squadron performed remarkably." Kale stood at attention. "Thank you, sir. The credit belongs to the entire squadron." "Perhaps," Volkov acknowledged, "but the concept was yours. Captain Rostova has recommended your immediate promotion and the formal establishment of what she's calling the Chaos Flight Program. Dr. Thorne has submitted a comprehensive theoretical framework supporting the scientific principles behind your flying technique." "Sir," Kale ventured, "what are your orders?" Volkov turned to look out the viewport at the stars. "For 20 years, I've commanded ships and fleets according to principles established generations ago. I've sent pilots to their deaths because our tactics were predictable." He turned back, his expression resolute. "That ends today, Lieutenant." "No, Commander Rewrote, you will take command of the Chaos Flight Program effective immediately. Captain Rostova will provide administrative oversight, and Dr. Thorne will continue his research. Your mission is to transform Coalition space combat." "Sir." Kale couldn't hide his shock. "You heard me, Commander." A ghost of a smile touched Volkov's lips. "You rewrote the laws of space combat. Now, I want you to teach others to do the same." In the months that followed, the Coalition military underwent a transformation unlike any in its history. The Chaos Flight Program expanded rapidly, with Kale and his original pilots serving as the core instructors. The challenges were significant. Not every pilot could adapt to the intuitive, flowing style required. Some remained firmly grounded in traditional techniques, their minds too fixed in analytical patterns to embrace the nebulous state between order and chaos. But for those who could adapt, the results were revolutionary. Synthetic forces that had been advancing relentlessly for years suddenly found themselves facing an enemy they could not predict. Colonial worlds that had been on the verge of being overrun received reinforcements of chaos wings that turned the tide of battle. For the first time in the Long War, the Coalition was pushing back. Dr. Thorne's research expanded beyond military applications. The principles of chaos field theory began influencing everything from hyperspace navigation to communication systems. The doctor theorized that what Kale had intuited was actually a fundamental property of reality, a layer of cosmic structure that existed at the boundary between deterministic order and pure randomness, accessible to human consciousness but incomprehensible to synthetic intelligence. For Kale, the most significant change was internal. The rebellious pilot who had chafed against authority now found himself in a position of leadership and responsibility. The lessons he had once struggled to articulate became clearer as he guided others to find their own flow state. And in Captain Rostova, now Admiral Rostova. He found not just a mentor, but a friend who understood the balance between discipline and intuition. 1 year after the Battle of Outpost Artemis, Kale stood before a new class of Chaos flight candidates. Among them was a young woman named Ilera, whose test scores showed exceptional intuitive potential. "The synthetics are adapting," he told the class honestly. "They're studying our methods, attempting to create algorithms that can predict even unpredictability. Every day we must evolve. Every day we must find new pathways through the chaos." "How?" Ilera asked. "If they can eventually predict even chaos, what advantage do we have left?" Kale smiled. "The advantage we've always had. We're human. Our consciousness isn't bound by algorithms or programming. We can always choose to break our own patterns, to rewrite our own rules. The moment we think we've mastered chaos is the moment we become predictable again." After dismissing the class, Kale found Reese waiting for him in the corridor. The veteran pilot had become his most trusted lieutenant, leading his own chaos wing with distinction. "New intelligence just came in," Reese reported, his expression grave. "The synthetics are developing something new, ships that can manipulate the chaos field itself. They're calling it Operation Entropic Collapse." Kale nodded, absorbing the information. The war was far from over. The eternal dance between order and chaos, between synthetic prediction and human intuition, would continue to evolve. But for the first time since the conflict began, humanity had rediscovered its greatest strength, the unpredictable, beautiful chaos of the human spirit. "Inform Dr. Thorne," he said calmly. "We need to begin working on countermeasures immediately." "And Reese?" "Yes, Commander." Kale smiled, feeling the familiar tingle of the flow state at the edges of his consciousness. "Tell the squadron to prepare for a training exercise. I've been experimenting with a new technique I call quantum fragmentation. I think it's time we rewrote the rules of space combat all over again." As Reese departed, Kale turned to look out at the stars. The void that had once seemed so empty to others had always been full of patterns to him, currents and eddies in the fabric of reality that defied conventional perception. The synthetics might adapt, might evolve, might even learn to predict chaos itself, but they would never truly understand what it meant to be human, to exist in that perfect, impossible balance between reason and instinct, between calculation and faith. The human-synthetic war would continue, but its fundamental nature had changed. In discovering the power of chaos, humanity had reclaimed its greatest advantage. And one human pilot had forever changed the course of the conflict, rewriting not just the laws of space combat, but the very relationship between sentient consciousness and the universe itself.